All right, let's jump into today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about something that's been in the headlines a lot lately, terrorism in the United States. Specifically, we'll be looking at a CSIS brief that analyzes 893 terrorist plots and attacks that took place between 1994 and May 2020. And here's a surprising fact right off the bat. In most years, right-wing attacks actually cause more fatalities than religious terrorism.
Wow. Yeah, that is surprising. You always hear so much more about religious terrorism.
Exactly. So today, we're going to dig into the evolving trends in U.S. terrorism, look at the different types of perpetrators, and examine the factors that could increase the threat in the coming year.
Sounds like a good plan. Definitely a lot to unpack there.
For sure. To get us started, can you give us a working definition of terrorism?
Sure. So, at its core, terrorism involves the deliberate use or threat of violence by non-state actors. Their aim is to achieve some kind of political change. And of course, create fear and disruption.
Right. So it's not just about the act itself,
Hmm.
but the broader impact it has.
Yeah, it's about the psychological impact.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how did the CSIS brief categorize the different types of terrorism they looked at?
Well, they focused on four main categories: right-wing, left-wing, religious, and ethno-nationalist. It's important to note, though, that this report doesn't cover hate crimes.
Okay, so what's the distinction there?
Hate crimes can definitely involve violence, but they also include nonviolent acts like vandalism or verbal abuse.
And I guess those aren't typically aimed at political change.
Right, exactly.
Got it. So, with those four types of terrorism in mind, what are some of the big trends we've seen since 1994?
The most striking thing that jumps out is the increase in far-right terrorism. It's responsible for more incidents than any other category.
Really?
Yeah, and while 9/11, of course, was a tragic outlier, right-wing attacks have actually been deadlier in most other years.
Wow, I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that. Can you give us an idea of just how much right-wing terrorism has grown?
The numbers are pretty clear on that. In 2019, right-wing extremists were behind two-thirds of all U.S. attacks and plots. And in the first few months of 2020, that number jumped to over 90%.
That's a huge increase. So it sounds like understanding right-wing terrorism is key to understanding the overall threat. Can you tell us more about who these right-wing extremists are and what motivates them?
Well, the CSIS brief divides them into three broad categories: white supremacists, anti-government extremists, and incels. And while each group has its own set of beliefs and goals, there are some interesting similarities that connect them.
Okay, I'm curious about that. What are some of those commonalities?
One thing they have in common is their decentralized structure. They operate on what they call leaderless resistance, which means individuals are encouraged to act independently.
So that must make them incredibly difficult to track.
Absolutely, it's a nightmare for law enforcement. And then, of course, they've really mastered the use of the internet. They've established a huge online presence, using social media, forums, even video games, to spread their ideology and recruit new members.
It sounds like they've borrowed some strategies from groups we used to think of as foreign.
That's a good point. They've learned a lot from groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, adopting techniques like encrypted communications and promoting a culture of martyrdom.
And like those groups, they're not limited to any one region.
Right. We've seen right-wing attacks in 42 states, D.C., and Puerto Rico in recent years.
Wow. So this is clearly a nationwide problem. Let's break down each of these right-wing groups a bit more, starting with white supremacists. What are their defining characteristics?
Well, as the name suggests, white supremacists believe in the superiority of the white race. They often hold racist and anti-Semitic views. And a lot of them subscribe to conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory.
What is that exactly?
It's the idea that white people are being intentionally replaced by minorities.
Oh, I've heard of that. It's a pretty disturbing and dangerous idea.
It is, and within this group, there are even more radical factions like the accelerationists.
I've heard that term thrown around. What do they believe?
Accelerationists want to speed up the collapse of Western governments, often through violence, to create a white ethno-state.
So they're not content with just maintaining the status quo?
Right, they want to actively bring about a societal collapse.
And they often use online platforms to spread this message.
Very effectively, actually. They use memes, social media, and online forums to create a sense of urgency and incite real-world action.
Are there any specific white supremacist groups that are causing particular concern?
One that stands out is the Atomwaffen Division, or AWD. They're known for their paramilitary-style training camps and have been linked to several plots targeting journalists and activists.
That's scary. So we've got white supremacy fueling one segment of the far right. But there's also a growing anti-government sentiment that seems even more widespread and harder to pin down. Can you tell us more about those anti-government extremists?
Sure. This group includes a pretty diverse range of actors. You've got militias like the Three Percenters and the Sovereign Citizen Movement. What unites them is a deep distrust of the U.S. government. They see it as corrupt and tyrannical.
Hmm. Is that a new phenomenon, or has that sentiment always been part of the American psyche?
It's a good question. I mean, distrust of the government has definitely been a theme throughout American history. But the internet has given these groups a much more powerful platform to amplify those sentiments and connect with like-minded individuals.
So, in a way, online platforms have helped turn this ideology into action.
Definitely. They use these platforms to organize, recruit, and spread their message.
What are some of their main concerns?
Well, they often see themselves as patriots fighting against government overreach, especially when it comes to things like gun control. They tend to be heavily armed and prepared for what they see as an inevitable conflict with the government.
That sounds pretty alarming.
Yeah, it's a volatile situation.
Yep.
For instance, there's the Boogaloo movement. They use that term as shorthand for a coming civil war. They spread conspiracies online and believe that violence is necessary to overthrow what they perceive as a corrupt and oppressive government.
It's concerning how they've created this whole subculture around this violent ideology, and it's all happening online. Now, let's move on to the third category of right-wing extremists, the incels. This seems to be a relatively new phenomenon.
It is. The term incel stands for involuntary celibate. It refers to an online community of men who blame women for their lack of romantic or sexual relationships.
So they feel entitled to sex and then lash out when rejected.
That's pretty much it. They often express extreme misogyny and resentment towards women, believing they're being unfairly denied something they deserve.
And this anger and frustration can manifest in violence?
Yes, tragically it has. There was the 2018 shooting at the yoga studio in Tallahassee, where the perpetrator specifically targeted women, driven by this twisted belief that they were responsible for his unhappiness.
Right, and then there was Elliot Rogers' rampage in Isla Vista, California. That's often seen as a turning point for the incel movement.
It is. His manifesto, which was full of hatred towards women and a desire for revenge, has become a disturbing source of inspiration for some incels.
It's scary how influential these figures can become, even after they're gone. Okay, we've covered the three main types of right-wing extremists. Now, let's shift gears and talk about left-wing terrorism. While it might not pose as big of a threat as right-wing extremism statistically, it's still something we need to understand.
Definitely. It's important to remember that terrorism can come from anywhere on the political spectrum.
Exactly.
So this category includes a pretty diverse range of actors. You've got anarchists, anti-fascist groups like Antifa,
hmm
and environmental and animal rights activists.
When we talk about Antifa, is that an organized group or more of a loose network of activists?
It's more of a decentralized network of individuals who oppose what they see as far-right and fascist ideologies. They often engage in counter-protests, which can sometimes escalate into violence and property damage.
So their tactics, while aimed at opposing what they see as a threat, can be controversial.
Exactly. Their methods have sparked a lot of debate, even among those who share their anti-fascist goals.
Can you give us some examples of their tactics?
Sure, they're known for their black bloc gatherings, which are basically demonstrations where participants wear black clothing and masks to hide their identities.
Ah, okay.
And these gatherings can involve the use of improvised weapons. They also rely heavily on online organization.
So how do they typically operate?
Recently, they've been confronting right-wing rallies, sometimes leading to violent clashes, and they've also been involved in attacks on demonstrators. There was even an attempted bombing of an ICE facility in Tacoma in 2019.
Wow, so what about the other left-wing groups? Anarchists and environmental activists, what are their methods like?
Anarchists, fundamentally, oppose all forms of hierarchy and authority, including the state and capitalism. So they sometimes target symbols of government and corporate power through property destruction and sabotage.
Would you say their goal is more about making a symbolic statement than causing widespread harm?
Yeah, that's generally true. They tend to avoid targeting people directly and focus more on disrupting systems and structures they perceive as oppressive.
Got it. And what about environmental and animal rights activists?
Groups like the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front have carried out attacks against companies involved in animal testing, logging, or other activities that they consider harmful to the environment or animals.
What kinds of tactics do they use?
Typically, their tactics involve property damage, like arson or vandalism, rather than violence against people.
So even within left-wing terrorism, there's a wide range of motivations and tactics.
Absolutely. It's a very diverse category.
Okay, let's move on to the third category, religious terrorism. This is probably the type of terrorism that's most on people's minds, given the impact of attacks like 9/11.
Yeah, 9/11 definitely shaped how we think about terrorism. But the good news is the threat of religious terrorism in the U.S. is currently not as high as in some European countries.
That's a little reassuring, but I'm sure there's still some risk.
Of course, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS continue to inspire followers. Even though their capabilities have been significantly diminished, they still pose a threat. We saw that recently with the 2019 Pensacola Naval Air Station shooting. The perpetrator, a Saudi Air Force cadet, was motivated by Al-Qaeda ideology.
It's a stark reminder that even lone actors, inspired by these ideologies, can pose a serious threat.
Definitely. And both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are actively encouraging attacks in the West. And there are still thousands of jihadist fighters operating globally, some of whom could try to enter the U.S.
So it's a multifaceted challenge.
It is. It's not just about preventing large-scale attacks. It's also about identifying and stopping individuals who might be radicalized online or influenced by extremist ideologies.
So preventing terrorism now goes beyond traditional intelligence gathering. It also involves monitoring online activity and understanding how radicalization happens in the digital space.
Absolutely. It's like a complex challenge that requires a comprehensive approach.
It sounds like
Now, before we move on to discussing the future, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far. We've established that the most significant terrorism threat in the U.S. today comes from right-wing extremists. Their attacks have been increasing in both frequency and severity. And, as we discussed, their decentralized nature and their savvy use of online platforms make them particularly difficult to combat.
yes, it's a pretty sobering picture. But understanding the threat is the first step in figuring out how to counter it. So, with that in mind, can you tell us what the future might hold? Is this threat likely to increase or decrease in the coming year?
Unfortunately, based on what we're seeing, it seems like the threat of terrorism is likely to increase, at least in the near future.
Oh, that's not good. What factors are experts particularly worried about?
One major concern is the upcoming 2020 presidential election. Experts think it has the potential to be more contentious than usual, which could further fuel existing anger and polarization.
Yeah, I mean, given the current political climate, it's not hard to imagine the election becoming a flashpoint.
Exactly. It could create opportunities for extremists on both sides. For instance, some far-right extremists have openly expressed support for President Trump, even threatening violence if he loses. They see him as a champion of their cause and fear that a Democratic victory would undermine their goals.
So their whole ideology is tied up with this one political figure.
In some cases, yes. And that's why the outcome of this election could be so volatile. But it's important to note, the risk of violence isn't limited to one side. We also have to consider the potential for violence from left-wing extremists if Trump is reelected. Remember the 2017 shooting of Congressman Steve Scalise? That was carried out by a left-wing extremist who hated Trump and the Republican Party.
Right, right. So political violence can come from anywhere.
Exactly. And the current political climate, combined with the high stakes of this election, creates a fertile ground for extremism, regardless of political affiliation.
So the election is a big worry. What other factors are contributing to this potential increase in terrorism?
The COVID-19 pandemic is another significant factor. It's caused so much economic and social disruption, and extremists can exploit that to recruit new members and incite violence.
Yeah, it makes sense. All the unemployment, business closures, lockdowns, it creates so much fear and uncertainty and anger.
Exactly. And extremists prey on those emotions. They offer simplistic explanations and scapegoats for complex problems. They might blame the government's pandemic response, calling it tyranny, or blame specific groups for spreading the virus.
It's like they're hijacking this global health crisis to push their own agenda.
Exactly. We've already seen examples of this. Remember Timothy Wilson?
Yeah.
The guy who was killed by the FBI while planning to bomb a hospital in Missouri?
Oh, yeah.
He had ties to neo-Nazi groups. And he specifically targeted a hospital because he thought it would generate more attention during the pandemic.
It's chilling that someone would try to capitalize on a pandemic like that. Are there other groups using the pandemic to their advantage?
Unfortunately, yes. Anti-vaxxer groups have been spreading conspiracy theories about the virus and vaccines, and their rhetoric has become increasingly violent. They portray vaccines as some kind of government control, even a plot to harm people. And they've gone so far as to threaten healthcare workers and government officials.
Wow, it's hard to believe that a global health crisis could be twisted into a justification for violence like that. Are there any other events or trends on the horizon that are adding to this risk?
Yeah, the potential for other polarizing events is another big concern. Things like mass shootings, racially motivated killings, or any incident that sparks widespread outrage and protests. Those can create opportunities for extremists. They might infiltrate protests, incite violence, and try to manipulate the narrative to advance their agenda.
Like what happened with the George Floyd protests last year. Were extremist groups involved in those?
Absolutely. Those protests were a perfect example of how extremists from all sides can exploit a volatile situation. White supremacists tried to instigate violence and racial conflict, while some elements within Antifa engaged in property destruction and clashed with police.
So they were using a legitimate movement for social justice as a cover for their own violent agendas.
Exactly. Extremists are always looking for opportunities to exploit existing tensions and amplify them for their own purposes.
So with the election, the pandemic, and the potential for other unforeseen events, it feels like the threat of terrorism is coming at us from all sides.
That's the reality we're facing. It's a complex and evolving threat, and it requires a comprehensive response.
Okay, so we've covered the various types of terrorism, the trends we're seeing, and the factors that are making the threat more intense. But the question is, how do we counter this growing threat, especially when it's so decentralized and often driven by individuals, rather than easily identifiable organizations?
That's the million-dollar question. It requires us to rethink our traditional approaches to counterterrorism. We can't just rely on the old playbook of going after large hierarchical organizations.
It's almost like trying to fight a ghost.
Yeah, it's not easy. There's no simple solution. But the CSIS brief does offer some insights and recommendations. They emphasize what they call a whole-of-society approach.
What does that mean?
It means that everyone has a role to play. Government agencies, law enforcement, social media companies, even individuals like you and me.
So it's not just about stopping terrorists after an attack. It's about preventing people from becoming radicalized in the first place.
Exactly. It's about addressing the root causes of extremism, building resilience in our communities, and fostering a culture of tolerance and understanding.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is,
Sure.
but it's the only way to truly tackle this problem.
So what can these different actors do to contribute to this whole-of-society approach?
Well, the government has a crucial role to play. They need to promote civility and discourage inflammatory rhetoric. Politicians need to set a good example and avoid language that demonizes groups or incites violence.
Yeah, the political discourse has gotten so toxic.
It has, so it's crucial for leaders to be responsible with their words and actively promote unity and respect even when they disagree with their opponents.
It's about de-escalating the tension.
Right. And of course, the government also needs to make sure that law enforcement agencies have the resources and training they need to investigate and disrupt terrorist plots.
That makes sense, but I imagine it's especially difficult with these decentralized groups operating online.
You're right. It's a constant challenge for law enforcement to keep up with this evolving threat. They have to develop new techniques and strategies to combat online radicalization and identify individuals who might be planning attacks.
So it's like a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, but it's playing out in the digital world. Now, what about social media companies? They've been under a lot of fire for their role in spreading misinformation and hate speech.
Yeah, and for good reason. Social media platforms have unfortunately become breeding grounds for extremism. Extremist groups use these platforms to recruit members, spread propaganda, and even plan attacks.
It's like they've accidentally created this parallel universe where dangerous ideologies can thrive.
It's a serious problem. So social media companies need to be much more proactive in combating extremism on their platforms. They need better algorithms to detect and remove hateful content. And they need to work more closely with law enforcement to identify and track users who might be engaged in dangerous activity.
So it's a balancing act between free speech and preventing harm.
Exactly. It's a tough balance to strike, but the stakes are too high to ignore the problem.
Agreed. So we've talked about the government and social media companies, but what about individuals? What can ordinary people do to help counter terrorism?
Individuals have a vital role to play in building resilience in their communities and promoting a culture of tolerance and understanding. We need to be aware of the signs of radicalization and speak out against hate speech and bigotry.
So we need to be vigilant in our own communities and not be afraid to challenge people who are spreading hatred and intolerance.
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right and create a society where extremism can't take root.
I like that. It's about taking ownership and not being passive bystanders. Are there other things individuals can do?
Of course, being critical consumers of information is crucial. We're bombarded with so much information these days. It's
Yeah.
easy to get caught up in echo chambers and filter bubbles, especially with all the fake news and propaganda out there.
So how do we avoid that?
Double check your sources. Be skeptical of information that just confirms your biases, and try to engage with different viewpoints.
Good advice. This reminds me of a quote from Gandhi that the CSIS brief mentioned. He talked about satyagraha, which means truth force. He said, Satyagraha is a weapon of the strong. It admits of no violence under any circumstance whatever, and it always insists upon truth. It's a reminder that we need to confront hatred and injustice with truth, compassion, and nonviolence.
Yeah, that's a powerful quote, and it's very relevant to our conversation. It reminds us that we don't have to stoop to the level of those who use violence and fear. We can choose a different path, one of peace and understanding.
I love that. It's about choosing the higher ground.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive. We've explored the complexities of terrorism in the U.S., the different groups and trends, and the things that are making the threat worse. But you've also highlighted that there is hope. We're not helpless against this.
Definitely not. We can all do our part to counter extremism, whether it's speaking out against hate speech, supporting community-based intervention programs, or simply being informed and engaged citizens. We all have a role to play.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This has been a really insightful conversation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into terrorism in the United States. We encourage you to keep learning about this important issue and think about what you can do to promote peace, tolerance, and understanding in your own communities.
So where do we go from here? How do we actually tackle this challenge, this threat that's so diffuse and constantly adapting? It really forces us to rethink those old counterterrorism strategies.
Right. It's like we need a whole new playbook. So what are some of those new approaches?
One promising area is community-based intervention. It's about working with local communities, getting them involved in identifying individuals who might be vulnerable to radicalization.
Okay, so kind of intervening early on.
Exactly.
Before they go too far down that path.
Exactly. Radicalization, it's often a gradual process. There are usually signs along the way.
Signs that people around them might notice.
Exactly. Family members, friends, teachers, religious leaders. The people closest to someone are often the first to see those red flags.
So they're in a unique position to help.
They are. Those community-based programs can be really effective. They can teach people about the dangers of hate speech, how to spot propaganda. It creates a sense of belonging, of purpose, making people less susceptible to extremist recruitment.
So it's about building up a kind of resistance to extremism.
That's a good way to put it.
Are there other strategies that are showing promise?
Another interesting area is using technology to counter online radicalization. Developing algorithms to detect and remove that extremist content, AI, to identify and track individuals who might be involved in something dangerous.
It's like fighting fire with fire, but in the digital world.
In a way, yes.
Mm.
We can use those same tools and tactics that extremists use, but for good instead of harm.
So technology is a key part of the solution.
It is. But it's only one piece of the puzzle. We can't forget about addressing the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to extremism. Poverty, inequality, discrimination, lack of opportunity. Those are all breeding grounds for the resentment and anger that extremists feed on.
So it's not just about targeting individuals, but about creating a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. We have to address those root causes, not just the symptoms. It's a long-term solution for sure, but it's crucial if we want to break this cycle of violence.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. The complexities of terrorism, the different groups, the trends, those factors that are intensifying the threat. But what I really appreciate is that you've also highlighted that there's hope. We're not helpless in the face of this challenge.
Definitely not. We can all contribute.
Yeah.
Whether it's speaking out against hate speech, supporting those community programs, or just being informed and engaged citizens, everyone have a role to play.
Well said. Thank you again for joining us today. Your expertise has been invaluable.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of terrorism in the United States. We encourage you to keep learning, stay informed, and think about what you can do to promote peace, tolerance, and understanding in your own communities. Until next time.